The engines on the island of Sodor are really useful in their own ways. Thomas is good at running his branch line. Percy is good at carrying the mail train. And Salty is great at handling the troublesome trucks. But Harvey is special in his own way. He is a crane engine. His special crane arm is used for hoisting engines, rolling stock, and vehicles back onto the rails, which makes him a little shy. One day, Harvey was resting at Dryot Airfield. His driver had gone for some tea, and his fireman was keeping him cool. He began to hum to himself when all of a sudden, a horn sounded. And all of a sudden, a bright yellow tow truck screeched in. "Sir, sir," he called, "I've just received news." The station master walked up. "What's the problem?" she asked. "Henry has had an accident up the line," he explained, blocking the tracks adjusted to the branch. The station master and Harvey gasped. Butch looked serious. "My chief has given my services to help with that situation." Just then, Harvey spoke up. "May I help?" he asked. I'm very good with rescue." "Sorry, old friend," Butch said, "but I'm afraid they've requested for my help instead. Sir Topham will have a job for you soon." And he drove away. Harvey was a little disappointed. Him not being needed was the furthest thing he'd ever want to hear. "I can help too," he murmured to himself. "I'm useful, aren't I?" "Of course you are," chuckled his driver. "You have a crane." "And what's the crane used for?" "Lifting engines back on the rails." Harvey smiled, but he thought about being more useful. Meanwhile, Henry was in a bad situation. Earlier, when he was delivering trucks to the docks, the trucks had played their silly games, as usual, causing him to slide out of control and crash into George, who was working on the new road. Needless to say, George was not all happy. "Clumsy green apple," he grumbled. "Why didn't you look where you're going?" "The trucks pushed me," cried Henry. "Excuses, excuses," yelled an ignorant George. He was soon glad by the time Butch arrived. Butch was astonished by how large the mess was. He was concerned but stern. "No problem for me," he called. "I'll have you out in a jiffy." "About time," grumbled George, but Butch ignored him. Soon the workmen got to work putting up the trucks and loading their loads. But by the time Butch got to work trying to lift Henry, he found the large green engine too heavy. Butch strained and revved as hard as he could. Eventually, black smoke began to pour from his engine. Eventually, he stopped resisting. "What's taking so long?" grumbled George. "Your engine is strained by the weight of Henry," called the tow truck man. "You can't pull this much longer." Butch sighed. "How are we going to help these two now?" he wondered. Then they heard a familiar whistle. "Huh," thought Henry, "that's welcoming news." Puffing into sight was none other than Harvey, who stood surprised at the mess. "Well, bless me," he cried. "What a mess!" "It's going to get worse if we don't do something about it," agreed Butch. "Do you think you can help me?" "You're a tow truck, right?" thought Harvey. "You should be able to do it on your own." "My engine will be blown to bits if I keep it up like this," argued Butch. Harvey looked back at Butch and then at Henry and George. The mess was so large, it looked like it couldn't be fixed. But Harvey knew that crane engines should never leave engines in trouble, so he set to work at once. He soon puffed up to Henry, and with one big breathe, hoisted his crane arm high and got to work. "Hold on," he called to Henry as he began to tug with all his might. When it cooled down, Butch was able to help too. The two tugged and revved with all their might, and at last, Henry was back on the rails. He and his crew were very relieved. Harvey smiled. Then, as soon as George was hoisted, Butch took him back to Jim-Co. Harvey thought he could hear Butch telling George not to grumble, which he and Henry chuckled. Later that night, Harvey was at the waterworks when Butch pulled up alongside him. Harvey, thank you for your service today," he said kindly. "Oh, that's all right," replied Harvey. "You know what they say, 2 hooks are better than 1 put together." Butch could only agree.